Friends, if you wouldn't mind joining me for a brief moment of shared silence. Thank you so much. Welcome everyone to this Conversation with Friends event. We're so excited to have you here tonight. A couple quick housekeeping items. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Anna Wyeth. I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement. I hope you will all keep your video on tonight if you feel comfortable doing so. It really does help us feel the full participation of everyone who's here in the Zoom room with us. I also want to encourage you to change your Zoom name if you haven't yet to include your full name and add your connection to Sidwell Friends. So if you're an alum, you can add your class year. Perhaps you're a parent of an alum or a grandparent, a current or former faculty member, whatever it might be. You can just think of it as your virtual name tag showing everybody else who is here tonight. And if you've never done that before, you can hover over your own name in the participant list. And under that More button, you'll see an option to rename, and that's where you can add that information. I'll ask that everyone keep themselves on mute just to minimize disruptions. And if you have a question throughout the course of tonight's event, please send it to me, Anna Wyeth, in the chat, and we will happily ask your question during the dedicated Q&A portion at the end of the event. So the real reason we're all here tonight is obviously to hear from our featured speakers. I'm so excited to introduce them. Dr. Treva Lindsey is the class of 2000 from Sidwell Friends, and it is her wonderful book tonight that we are here to discuss. Treva specializes in African-American women's history, Black popular and expressive culture, Black feminism, hip hop studies, critical race and gender theory, and sexual politics. Her first book is Colored No More, Reinventing Black Womanhood in Washington, D.C. She has published in the Journal of Pan-African Studies, Souls, African and Black Diaspora, and the Journal of African American Studies, among many, many other publications. She was also the inaugural Equity for Women and Girls of Color Fellow at Harvard University for the 2016-2017 school year. Treva is the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including ones from the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, Emory University, the National Women's Studies Association, the Coca-Cola Critical Difference for Women grant, the Center for Arts and Humanities at the University of Missouri, and the College of Arts and Sciences at the Ohio State University, where she teaches full-time. Dr. Lindsey was the inaugural recipient of the University of Missouri Faculty Achievement in Diversity Award, and she's the co-editor of a forthcoming collection on the future of Black popular cultural studies. She's also the current co-chair of the Women of Color Leadership Project for the National Women's Studies Association. She is building a strong online presence by guest contributing to outlets like Al Jazeera, BET, Complex Magazine, Cosmopolitan, HuffPost Live, NPR, The Root, and The Mark Steiner Show. And how she has any time to spend with us tonight after doing all of that, I do not know. Leading tonight's conversation with Treva is a familiar face to all of you. Bryan Garman began his tenure as head of school at Sidwell Friends in 2015. He served as head of school at Wilmington Friends in Delaware from 2006 to 2015, after a 9-year stint with us at Sidwell Friends as a history teacher, department chair, director of the summer studies program, upper school principal, and assistant head of school. Bryan received his PhD in American Studies from Emory University and is the author of A Race of Singers, Whitman's Working Class Hero from Guthrie to Springsteen. He currently sits on the board of directors at the Association of Independent Schools of Greater Washington and the Friends Council on Education, where he's a member of the Task Force on Racial Justice. He has also served on the governing board of the National Association of Independent Schools and has been their secretary, sat on the Equity and Justice Committee, and co-chaired the subcommittee on equity and inclusion. So Bryan, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started in this wonderful conversation.
All right. Thank you, Anna. Thanks to everybody for being here with us. And it's, Treva, an honor to be with you. I always learn so much when I hear you speak. The last time you were here and gave a talk to our faculty was really very memorable. And we've all picked up on this wonderful term you introduced to us called critical generosity, which I remember and am very grateful for you for not simply teaching those students at Ohio State, but teaching the faculty who taught you. It's really, thank you for asking me to be part of this conversation tonight. I just want to, before we get started, I want to read two blurbs from the back of the book. Here it is. And it's all lined up behind me. I'm very excited about this. But a blurb on the back from Ibram Kendi and one from Melissa Harris Perry, who is at Wake Forest, but we also know as a media star from MSNBC. So Kendi writes, an impeccably researched and intensely told history of the terror, of the violence, of the dehumanization Black women and girls have faced, battled, and resisted. It gripped me, shocked me, angered me, enlightened me, moved me, transformed me. We are better because of this book. And Harris Perry writes, Treva B. Lindsey pours out the spiritual agony of bearing witness and witness to the destruction of Black girlhood. She dares her readers to stay present intellectually and emotionally, even as she performs a bloody historical autopsy of American misogynoir. Really high praise for what is an extraordinary book. So Treva, thank you for being with us tonight.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure. It's always a pleasure to be back among friends.
Yeah, well, there's a lot on here. I noticed a lot of familiar faces from that class of 2000. So welcome to all of them. Yeah, it's great to have them with us. You know, Treva, one of the things that struck me at first was the title, right? Which I knew immediately from the Nina Simone song. Tell us, if you would, let's start there and just tell us why that. It's such a powerful song.
Well, the song is a song that sticks with you for a number of reasons. And part of it is the inspiration for the song and then actually the construction of the song. So as someone who is a dancer, who is very attuned to the expressive outlets that we choose, music has always been a text for me that I want to pull from, that I want to remix, that I want to riff off of when I'm thinking about titles, when I'm thinking about conceptualizing. And Nina Simone is one of my favorite artists. She's also a North Carolinian, which I consider like my homeland. That's where my parents are from. And she's someone who opts in to social justice at a very particular moment. She had not done any political songs before Mississippi Goddam. And even though we remember her as a particularly politicized artist now, this was actually the first song and the first time. And she felt compelled to do it as a result of the assassination of Medgar Evers in Mississippi and the 4 little girls being killed at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. And one of the things I thought about with this song is that so often we just say the 4 little girls when we talk about that particular form of white supremacist terror and violence. We don't say their names. And it brought me to the contemporary moment in which we have this demand, this hashtag to say her name. And so in the book, I was insistent of naming them. Carol, Cynthia, Addie, and Denise, these 4 little girls who were killed, and Sarah, who was severely injured and is still living today, who was in that basement with those 4 little girls. And Nina Simone feels charged and compelled to tell the story of anti-Black violence in the United States as a result of these 2 spectacular instances of violence. And she's also talking about the resistance that Black people mount in the face of what is seemingly relentless and ubiquitous in terms of violence. And so this song in 3.5 minutes does what I attempt to do in 240 plus pages, which is to give you that relentlessness of unlivable living, of spectacular and slow death, of Black girls and Black women and gender expansive people being conscripted to premature death through these different death dealing systems, and to talk about the resistance and why I still have hope, even with all of that at stake. And so what she does in the song is give you all of these different places where violence that happens, even though she homes in on a Mississippi. It really is America Goddam. And so the title is a nod to that in both framework and a nod to what charges us to do the work that we do. What incidents really charge us to get involved, to get energized, to mobilize around particular things.
It's such a powerful title because as you read the book, which is also so powerful, And so consciousness raising in its content and in its application of theory, that, you know, as a reader, you can find yourself almost using that expression. There's nothing else to say.
Yeah, it can leave you speechless. I mean, I had to find words because I had to write it. That's what I'm supposed to do as an author.
Yeah.
But there are just moments when sometimes all I wanted to say was, God damn, it just felt so overwhelming. It just felt so soul crushing and so difficult to wade through this archive of violence that begins on slave ships and moves into a neighborhood 15 minutes from where I live in Columbus.
Yeah.
Right. So I really wanted to take that journey and be a partner with the reader through that journey of here's how you read it. And it's okay to react like that, because that's a visceral and important reaction to have. I hope people are saying, God damn, when they're reading this.
And as you put the book together, I mean, you speak in the introduction about a very intentional structure that you're trying to create. There's an ethical framework you're building as you go through this. And at one point, you actually say that you wanted to handle the subjects warmly. Right. Tell us a little bit about how you built that structure and why it was important.
So there's one way that you could do this book and be very distanced from it. I'm trained as a historian. I go into the archive and I can tell you the story. And I didn't think that that was the best way to tell this story. I don't think that was the most compelling way to talk about these stories. And it also didn't do a service to the women and girls and gender expansive people that I talk about in the book. They are whole people. They were loved by family members, communities. They are still loved by those people. And so I wanted to find a way not to just make them objects of what I'm studying or points of evidence for some claim or assertion that I'm attempting to make, but to really think about who they were before this moment where they become part of this horrific archive. I wanted to know, what kind of songs did they listen to? Breonna Taylor's favorite song was My Everything by Mary J. Blige, right? I wanted to know if they loved or they had a relationship where they were getting ready to go on a date, or if they were planning to do something different in life, a big pivot in their career, or if they just loved cupcakes or whatever it was. I wanted to make sure that my approach was life affirming. I didn't just want them to be dead subjects or assailed subjects for those who were victims of non-fatal violence, because that's not all of who we are. It is never all of who we are. That moment is but one moment in a long arc, even when it's a short period of time that they lived. Someone like Ayanna Stanley Jones, who's killed at 7 years old by police, that for those 7 years, she meant everything to the people in her life. And so to handle these individuals warmly, these communities warmly, meant to take the charge from Ntozake Shange's For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough, where she demands that we let Black girls be born and held warmly. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to speak to that tradition. I wanted to be ethically aligned with the Black feminist tradition of the way we do this work. So it is not just about Black girls and women. I'm writing with Black girls and women. Right? These are stories that resonate with me. These are part of the frequencies in which my life is also moving.
Yeah, that's that witness idea that, you're bearing witness, but you're also bearing witness. And part of the structure is that you share a lot of your own autobiography, which to me, is very powerful, right? So I'm not simply just reading the archive, as you say. There's your presence in the book is part of a rehumanization project. Tell us a little bit about how you decided that, and maybe even talk about what was difficult or liberating about it. What was the experience of incorporating your narrative?
So let me be completely honest with y'all, since I'm among friends, right? I really ran from this book in a number of ways. I was going to write a 90s book. That was my next book that I was writing, like a history of Black girlhood in the 90s kind of girl. I was going to talk about bamboo earrings and FUBU and baby fat. I had it all mapped out what I was going to do, why Different World meant so much to me, all of these really kind of pop culture things that spoke to this. And so much of my public writing, which was a pivot in my career as an academic as well, was requests to write about violence. And the first public piece that I wrote for a large outlet for Cosmopolitan was about a now ex-police officer who was targeting Black women and girls in Oklahoma City and engaging in various acts of sexual predation and misconduct. And that brought up for me an encounter I had with a police officer, but I hadn't named it as such until that point. And as I was walking through various forms of violence that I mapped out in the book, I had to be very honest about the ways that that violence felt very close to me, that I felt in proximity to it, whether it was an experience that I had or someone that I loved had had. And so my editor was like, why don't you put that in there? You know, and I'm like, I don't know, that feels like it'll be super vulnerable. It'll be really hard to do. Will it be taken seriously among my academic peers? Whatever that means of doing this kind of memoir-ish personal accountability, personal account, and sort of autoethnography, if you will, approach to this subject. But she's like, it's going to give your reader a way to anchor in and hopefully give you a way to own, identify, assert, and begin to restore from the kinds of violence that you talk about that you've incurred. And so there are a lot of things that aren't in the book about violence that I've experienced, but there were things in there that are, that were ways for me to begin to process and to begin to name the ways that violation had impacted my life as a Black woman and as a Black girl. And I think that that helps with readers trying to engage this as well. It builds an intimacy with the reader. It builds a closeness. It builds an affective way of engaging this topic, not just was effective. I can give you all the data points, right? It means something very different.
Right, meticulously.
I mean, you know, it means something, right? I was saying when I first wrote this, when I first finished this book, the average was about a Black woman was being killed every 17 hours. As of last year, an average of 4 Black women and girls are killed every day, right? That's a harrowing statistic to sit with. But what I wanted to do in the book is like drill down to like, who is that? Who's being killed? And so I wanted to talk about my friend Erica, who was killed by her partner, and their kids who were killed by her partner. I wanted to talk about Shantae. I wanted to talk about the pervasiveness of that as an experience that I knew in close proximity to me, to make sure that data didn't just stick as a damn, that's terrible. It's like, these are people with communities and families. What is going to charge us to do something different in response to this level of violation and harm? What is this world missing because those individuals aren't here or have been injured in such an irreparable way that they no longer bring the special gifts and joy and creativity that they have to this world? We lack, we lose when we keep assailing and harming Black girls and women.
You, part of the autobiographic information that shows up in here and the ethnography, the autoethnography, as you call it, is your experience of Sidwell Friends. How did that shape the book? How has it shaped your lives, your consciousness, your understanding of all of this?
Yeah, Sidwell was really eye-opening for me for a number of reasons, and affirming reasons, on the sense that, of course, I'm sitting here looking at so many good friends who are my family and in many ways on that end. But on another end, the different worlds that I felt like I was moving between at Sidwell, especially coming more from Northeast and then moving to Prince George's County, but spending a considerable amount of time in Northeast Washington, D.C., and seeing the way the communities I lived in were policed versus the communities that I engaged once I got to Sidwell. It was starkly different. I felt protected and served in various contexts, in the context of Sidwell policing and Sidwell neighborhoods policing. And I felt criminalized and targeted when I was on Benning Road, or I was on Suitland Parkway, or I was on Off Road. Those are very different experiences. And Sidwell really made me acutely aware of the different experience of officer friendly and the fear and anxiety that I have when I encounter policing, and the different ways that that's experienced, particularly growing up in DC and then PG County in the 80s and 90s, right? We're talking about the hyper criminalization of
Right.
communities, the language of super predator. We're talking about illicit drug economies. We're talking about the demonization of people who are living with drug addiction. We are talking about the heightening of targeted mass incarceration that depletes the communities that I feel most accountable to and I feel connected to. And then I get to Sidwell and it's like, oh, we're all drinking and doing drugs on the weekend. No shade, not trying to snitch y'all, but we're doing these things on the weekend. And at best, it's a citation, right? At best, if that, right? It is not going to ruin the rest of your life. It is not going to be a mark on you in the way that impacts you or impacts you permanently and in a way that is so loaded in particular racist stereotypes and particularly anti-Black stereotypes that were proliferating about the people I was growing up with. And so I think Sidwell really opened my eyes and magnified the different worlds in which we operate, the different logics that undergirded policing depending on what your position was, right? And so it at least gave me an understanding of why someone would believe that police are okay. Because if you've only had that experience, and you understand the institution of policing as one that protects and serves, it's very different than I'm having a conversation at 4, 5, 6, 7 with my parents about why they were so mean to the woman on the corner and assaulted her. Those are very different views of policing and very different views of how you take in who's criminalized and who's protected and served.
And you share very clearly and powerfully how this was part of your experience.
Absolutely. You know, this book was cathartic in certain ways. And in the book, I write about being sexually assaulted by a police officer and really identifying and naming it for the first time as a sexual assault. It took me years, even when I was writing about police sexual misconduct, I had kind of written that off as a bad experience with police. I knew it was in the larger scheme of things a violation of my rights, but to name it as a sexual assault and to be clear about that as someone who has been multiply attacked through sexual violation, but that one just never, I just could never name it. And so in this book, I felt a kind of just liberatory moment for myself to actually name it, identify that experience, and connect that to why I feel so deeply impassioned about the ways that Black girls and women are policed and criminalized. Because that incident absolutely could have gone even farther than it did. And there's so many examples of those kinds of incidents going so much farther than even what happened to me.
It's such an extraordinary book in the way you bring that to life. And you have this incredibly meticulously researched archive that is so detailed and evoking the lives of the women and girls you're writing about. And you've been taking it not just, at a university press like University of California, but you've mentioned writing in other areas, speaking in other areas. And there's a way, it seems to me, that you're beginning to transcend the notion of historian and becoming a public intellectual. Do you think about yourself in that way and what the purpose of that is?
That's a great question. I mean, I also absolutely identify with being like a publicly engaged scholar, right? That I thought about this book in terms of who I'm accountable to. Yeah. I didn't write this book to be accountable to a promotion and tenure committee or to have the kudos of my peers that I've written the tome on violence in Black women. I wrote this for Black girls and women to see themselves, to validate and affirm their stories, to affirm their truths, their experiences, the multiple ways that they may feel attacked and assailed, the multiple ways they feel affirmed and loved and resistant. I wanted that to be the case. So I wanted it to be a book that almost anyone could pick up. And I know there, because of academic, there's theory in here, there are things, but I absolutely believe in the capacity of the folks who are living through these experiences, who do theorize their experiences, just not necessarily in the ways that we recognize in the academy, that I wanted a book that moved between those spaces. I want to be deliberate in that the work that I do is always attentive to the audiences that I'm accountable to, not who I'm trying to impress or prove anything to.
Yeah,
That that really lifted so much of the weight of how I would write this book once I decided that this book was about accountability, not about a line on my CV or proving something about who I am as a scholar. I think the rigor and the care matter. And if I had to choose the care, and because I care, it is rigorous. Because I care, it is specific. Because I care, I want to get the details. I want to get the data right. I want to get the names right. I want to get the experiences right because I care, not because the rigor trumps the care, but because the care demands rigor. And I think that that is what makes someone a truly public engaged scholar, that they have decided that they're accountable to a certain audience, a certain community, and they are writing into that community. They are writing alongside that community. I'm not claiming to speak for Black women and girls. Rather, I'm speaking from among us and offering some perspective and some insight and a way to think about the enduring ways that violence and violation impact our lives.
It's so, it just strikes me how aware you are of the project, right? I mean, that caring comes through on every page. And the theory doesn't diminish the emotional impact of what is a extraordinarily powerful and really beautifully written book. It had to be hard though. It's right, as beautifully written as it is, as much as you're with us through it, it is a hard book.
Yes.
And what was the hardest part of it? What were the biggest challenges you faced in writing it?
You're right. I'm thinking of the reactions of people who love and care about me who've responded to this book. And it's like, I just want to come give you a hug right after they read it, or
Right.
Want to debrief or unplug because it is so heavy and because it is radically honest. And by that, just mean getting at the root of what is happening and what has happened to me. I stepped away from this book for a while, even though I was like, I'm gonna do the 90s book, I'm gonna do this. And then once this book locked in, right, it was like, this is the book you're gonna be writing right now. I had to develop a practice to be able to do it. So, because the first time I was trying to do this, it was literally wearing me down. It was wearing me down physically, it was wearing me down emotionally. I was going to sleep and having nightmares. Like, it just was not anything. And unfortunately, the nightmares are prompted by the fact that people I'm looking at were literally killed while they're sleeping.
Mhm.
Right. So I'm thinking about a Breonna Taylor, or I'm thinking about Ayanna Stanley Jones, right? When I'm thinking about what it means for someone to burst through your door as you're sleeping and kill you. So I was like, I can't do this. So I made some very clear parameters. I don't wake up and write about this or think about this. I'm not going to watch incessant videos and loops and all of that. I'm not doing any of that. And I'm not going to go to sleep doing any of that. I'm going to have joy and affirmation. I am going to practice the freedom that I want Black girls and women to live in, which means I want to practice the points of pleasure and the worlds I want to see and create. So that for me is watching my favorite shows. So in the morning, that was probably an episode of like A Different World or something, and listening to, I don't know, maybe not in the morning, maybe a little later in the morning, I would listen to like Meg Thee Stallion or something just to get hype and get ready to do some work. And then at the end of the day, I'll probably watch Golden Girls. That was such a calming, laughing, grounding thing.
Very different from what you're written about.
Very different. Although the rumor is my next book is going to be why Black people love Golden Girls so much. So I think that there is something really, it was really important for me to do that. It was really important to have friends who were checking in on me through the process, because a lot of this book was also written during a pandemic that was disparately impacting Black communities. And it was written after losing my father. It was written after dealing with a considerable amount of grief. And so in many ways, I was using this and grounding this in all of those emotions, but remembering that I'm fighting for a world where the kinds of freedoms that I'm demanding are already in existence. And so I wanted to dance. I used dance. I sure my neighbors downstairs, I like would knock them like, I'm gonna dance today, just so y'all know, to let them know. Or, have a really good food. I mean, as many people did during COVID, because you were home and you were cooking. I really stepped up my cooking game over COVID and just ate really well, or just went on walks with good friends here and remembered that. And I just pushed through it. And I feel like I was supposed to write this book. So I also think that grounded it as well. That,
Mhm.
there were days where I could write 2,500 words, which was bananas, because I was just pushing through it and I just saw it and it just came. I would talk through it and then I would write it and I'd get through it and then I was done. And when I was done with it, I put it away. I
Mhm.
did not let myself sit with it too long. I, would do the edit and then I send it to my editor. So I wasn't holding it for any extended period of time beyond the actual writing of the thing. So I felt very cared for throughout the process. I was deliberate about caring for myself throughout the process. But it's a book I wrote with almost zero touch, right? I wasn't touching people because it was COVID. So
Right.
I hugged my mom. I think that if the fact that I can count the hugs and things I had at the time that I was writing it is very telling, right? And so I had to build a certain kind of intimacy into the book and an intimate practice into the writing of the book.
There is a literary element to it where it almost sounds like, you described it almost like it came through you,
Yes.
right? It feels like you were meant to write this book because of
It,
the care that you give the subject.
yes. And I, whatever, as resistant as I might have been, but there were so many things that happened that just pushed me towards this book and pushed me towards this version of myself as a writer, because this was also a really big challenge for me as a writer, to blend history and theory and personal account memoir into one piece that reads and that people are going to want to read, that a high schooler who picks this up may want to read, who a scholar maybe want to pick up and read. I wanted my grandmother, who passed away before my first book came out, but she had the copy of like the copy edits, the galley. There we go. And she only had, my father's mother only had like about a fifth grade education, and I was like, I want to make sure whatever I write next, my Nana could read.
Yeah.
Right, and read and feel seen and feel validated in her experiences as a Black woman who came up in the 1920s, right? And could see herself in her thread and her history, but also what is now my ancestral inheritance of fighting for a world that she couldn't even imagine at certain points. And so I want to continue to tear down the things that make it impossible even to imagine other kinds of worlds and other kinds of possibilities.
It's very, very powerful. Your grandmother must have been so amazingly proud.
Yeah, the Lindsey Streeter clan are a proud clan. Very, very proud.
It's such an amazing book. But so there's a lot of emotional challenges in it, and one of the things you mentioned too, it's almost like you're giving birth to a new form almost, right? It really is inventive. Were there the whole thing is tough to write about. Every topic is hard. Are there certain areas that are or certain chapters that were more difficult than others?
Yes, absolutely. The hardest chapter to write was the chapter about intracommunal violence. And that's the chapter where I'm discussing things that are happening oftentimes that happen at the hands of people you love and people who love you. So what happens in proximity? What happens in these more intimate encounters? And how do I talk about that in ways that doesn't lean into pathologizing narratives, stereotypical narratives, racist narratives about Black communities, right? How do I talk about the pervasiveness of domestic violence, homicide, and Black women being overrepresented in that number without demonizing Black people, and more specifically cisgender Black men and boys, right? How does one do that? And how does one handle that with care? And I literally write my trepidation about the chapter into the chapter. I was like, I am worried at this very moment that what I am writing here will be weaponized against Black people. And my deep abundance of love for marginalized folks and for freedom will never allow me to fall into or even trace the line of pathologizing or criminalizing narratives. But it does demand honesty, right? It does demand that we reckon with the severe amount of violence that Black trans women incur. It demands that. And over 90% of those occur at the hands of Black men and boys. And so what is at the core of that? Which is not just saying that Black men and boys killed Black trans women, but what are the systems that are operating, right? How is transphobia imbibed? How is misogynoir, the specific kind of racist misogyny that Black women endure, imbibed in that? How is white supremacy operating? How does the gender binary impact that, and the regulation of Black gender impact those kinds of statistics? Because we're all internalizing awful messages about marginalized people. Just because you're marginalized doesn't mean you have a consciousness that is somehow evading the negative messages that you get, right? We live in an anti-Black world. We live in a sexist world, a misogynistic world, a fat-phobic world, an ableist world, a queer-phobic world, right? An Islamophobic world, an anti-Semitic world. We live in a world with an abundance of ways that are marginalizing people out of power and out of full possession. And the internalization of that is really easy to do. And so in many ways, that chapter was attempting to pull the veil back on what it means to internalize anti-Blackness and how that manifests in gender and sexual violence, in patriarchal violence, in non-fatal violence within communities that are in proximity to one another, right? So it's still keeping a systemic and structural analysis, but allowing for an intimate portrayal of how we grapple with this, right? So it's going back to Pat Parker's poem in 1971 when she's like, brother, it is not the system that hit me last night. I'm no genius, but it was your fist, right? And to be clear about the system exists and does awful things, but how do we divest from systems and learn the logics of these systems that tell us that waging harm against those in proximity to us, those we're in intimate community with, is the way to respond to that structural and systemic encroachment on your humanity, right? And so it's a refusal in many ways to let that overdetermine our humanity, the internalizing of all of the things that say we're less than or undeserving of. And so it was very like, how do I do this and hold all of these things and make sure that people are walking away being like, she says Black men and boys are more violent than other communities, right? Like, if that's what you walk away with, one, you did not read it well, or you didn't read it closely. But I also would take that on as something, did I fail as a writer and as a theorist and as a communicator, if that's what you walk away with, as opposed to a deeper structural analysis that's rooted in the intimate and the interpersonal.
True, I could talk to you all day long about this and have a lot more questions I could ask you, but I want to make sure that our audience gets an opportunity to ask questions too. So I hope that we get some there. If not, you and I will keep going, but I suspect there's going to be a lot of questions here about what is really a very important book and is really, I think, a gift to all of us. The way you wrote it, the effort you put into it, the way you share in it, it's really an extraordinary experience to read this book, Treva. So I hope that our friends will buy the copy, right? Make sure you all buy it. And Treva said she's going to be back in DC soon, and maybe we can get her to sign a few copies of it. I'm hoping that she will make it to campus to sign a few here. But do we have any questions? On Anna, do you want to take the questions if they're coming in?
Yeah, we do have a few. We have a couple that came in before and a couple that have just come in, but feel free, please, to continue sending questions in the chat. One question I wanted to offer that actually came in before tonight's event. This is from Braden K, who's class of 2001.
He's on the line too.
Treva, you taught at public universities during an important time in our nation's grappling with race. I'm curious about your thoughts on how your students think about the struggles of today and your thoughts on how they view the history of race and gender in America and the role of history in processing the challenges of today. Yeah. I'm also curious, sorry, last part, I'm also curious about your advice on how we authentically and fully decolonize and deconstruct patriarchy in high school and college curriculums.
Woo, easy questions, Braden. Thank you, Braden, for those wonderful questions. So first, yes, I've been at public universities now. This is my 12th, I'm finishing my 12th year at a public university. I've been at Mizzou and here at Ohio State, the Ohio State. And I'm heartened, right? I'm a little spoiled, so I'll concede this. I'm in women's gender and sexuality studies, which is a major in many ways that often is kind of self-selecting, and really people who are very interested in social justice and very interested in questions around race, gender, sexuality, class, disability, imperialism, decolonizing, right? I get an abundance of students who like literally just like want to come to office hours and talk to me about like, so how are we going to dismantle the patriarchy today, Dr. Lindsey, right? And I'm like, okay, well, I was just gonna eat my Doritos, but if you want to talk about this, let's try this, right? So I think that's been really heartening. But I am also in Ohio, which is such an interesting state to be in with regards to kind of taking the temperature of the nation with so many issues, be that reproductive justice. We also have an anti-CRT and anti-trans bill that's moving through our legislature right now. And my students are fired up. They're really energized. My classes have never been bigger. And I think that's across the board in departments on our campus that are attuned to issues of race and gender. We recognize that the empire right now is striking back and is really retooling around particular issues of reclaiming power and privilege. And so it's been compelling for me as a teacher to see my students push me to think about these things and to have all these modes of engagement that they're encouraged to do. So, you know, they'll be teaching me like, this is what we do with TikTok to teach about patriarchy. I'm like, that sounds awesome. Not gonna be me, but that sounds amazing. And it affords this kind of intergenerational conversation by which we can talk about the range of strategies that we need to combat these rollbacks on social justice and the public good and people being cared for by these systems. And so my students give me the hope, right? They give me so much hope. And being at a public university where a number of my students are also full-time working and are experiencing the market, they're experiencing houselessness, they're experiencing what's happening right now in really profound ways. I literally had a student email me right before now that she just got laid off, right? And so, you know, thinking about how we in an immediate way directly assist our students who are feeling the brunt of where we are right now, and also how that powers her to think about critiques of capitalism and transnational markets and all of that, that she is experiencing that in very real ways, and that powers that. I think as a historian, I got to teach a history class for the first time this semester at OSU. I've been trained as a historian since 2004. Let's just be clear. I've been training and teaching as a historian, and this was my first history class that I ever got to teach. And the importance of that for me was that I always like to give students the big picture, right? The long arc, so you can see the continuities, the fissures, the breaks, the evolutions, the connections, because that really lands for students. I think the history really helps them understand how we get to a certain point where, you know, people believe that Black people feel less pain than other communities. How do we get there? What brought us to that in terms of our understanding? And that means something. And so I think to work on decolonizing, one, I think I want to be careful here in how I think about decolonizing, because unless we're really talking seriously about land back, then we're talking about this in very like esoteric ways that I understand the importance of thinking about decolonizing our minds and our education and who we're including, who we're talking about, the ways we talk about these things. But we also owe a great debt to our Indigenous folks in this context. And so I think it also means talking to Indigenous communities, talking to the descendants of slavery in the United States, and thinking about what does it mean to rebuild a nation, right? What does it mean to think about other documents of freedom that aren't ones that were written by slaveholders, that weren't ones that believed in the subordination of women and that Indigenous genocide was okay? What does it mean to imagine new ways of actually building democracy for the first time in the United States? I think that's the process we have to embark upon, which is a lot of work. That's a multi-generational work. That's not just us. And this is all given that we actually become stewards of the planet and don't keep killing our planet. So
Minor
detail there.
There's so much in what you just said, and then we know, as you mentioned, the work that's being done around the anti-critical race theory bill, the anti-trans. How do you speak with students about how to engage that kind of backlash that is occurring?
So the first thing I'm always, when people are anti-critical race theory, and it's funny because I will now get questions at a lot of my public events about, well, what do you think of critical race theory? And I'm like, I'm literally talking about Insecure in this presentation.
Right. And this is your public intellectual role. This is
right. So they're like, you can talk about anything that
exactly.
Right?
But seriously, it's a serious question because you are teaching students.
Right. And I'm like, here's the thing, right? First of all, I will give you $100 if you can tell me what critical race theory is, right? And that's one part of the conversation that literally has been bandied about. And kudos to whoever put this anti-CRT thing in the coffers, because it has done an excellent job of literally being able to know nothing about critical race theory and get people outraged about it and moving in ways to protest it and engage it. I selectively took a critical race theory in graduate school. Was not mandatory, was not required, because the course that develops from critical legal studies. Most people don't know who Derek Bell is, Richard Chabelle Scott. They might know Kimberly Crenshaw more so from intersectionality than they know from one of the kind of originators of critical race theory. But what I'm saying is, we want to be truth tellers in what we do. And our truths are complicated and messy and uncomfortable. And if knowledge about our past is comfortable, we're not doing it right? Because we should want to learn lessons from what we've been through, right? That doesn't indicate that we can't move beyond that, because there are various ways that we can show that we have. And so I think it's really important when students get that pushback to y'all studying race stuff or critical race theory or, gender beyond the binary or whatever the dismissive posturing is to that kind of knowledge, is to say, what's at stake in not learning those things, right? What's at stake? What are you afraid of? Because anti-CRT, anti-trans, all of these things are rooted in a particular kind of fear around power shifting and moving, right? And history for me is always about power, perspective, and ideology. Who has the power? Who has the privilege to dictate and tell it? And whose ideologies shape that? And right now, we are narrowing those perspectives, we're narrowing those ideologies, and we're consolidating power, which is anti-historical and really anti-progress. And it's anti a more inclusive vision of the world. And you give students the tools to be able to think about what is significant and rigorous and intellectually stimulating about actually having that kind of approach to history, as opposed to this very narrow conception of what a historical narrative is.
Thank you, Treva.
Yeah.
I want to pivot to a different question, if that's okay. More about you and your process. This is also from a classmate, from Eliza McCoy, but could you talk a little bit about your evolution as a writer from your first book now through this one?
A whole lot. When I wrote my first book, I wouldn't have considered myself a writer. I just recently kind of embraced the title of writer fully. I believe in a discipline. Like, I'm much more comfortable saying like I'm a dancer, because I trained, I disciplined, I've done that for years. Writing, and I will certainly give my hat off here to our wonderful, no longer with us teacher, Mr. Tonkin, was one of the first teachers that I had that really encouraged me around writing, and really told me that I had something to say and that I was holding back, that I wasn't being my most authentic self. I still have my paper that I got a B on where he wrote, it's almost you, right? That's actually something he wrote to me. And I knew that the book would resonate when someone picked this up and they could actually, if they knew me or had ever engaged me, could kind of feel me in the room with them, that it had to, for me, develop a writing voice that was deeply tethered to who I am and the ways that I express myself. So it had to have a rhythm, It had to have a flow. It had to have these moments where you break out of like, I can be really rigorous and academic, and then I'd be like, you know what, girl? It had to have that kind of ebb and flow because that was authentically me. And that kind of, I think, sincerity as a writer and that infusion of myself into that is what helped me develop as a writer, so that I was clearer about what my voice was and what I was trying to do with my writing, that my writing had more purpose other than like, I need to write this, or I need to write this book for tenure, or I am writing a dissertation. This felt more intentional and therefore more rooted in who I am. And so I continue to write all the time. I literally got up most days before everything else started and just wrote whatever I needed to write. It didn't have to be anything in particular or have to go anywhere, but 200, 300, 400 words, whatever I could get out, even if I could only get out 12 that day. I made a commitment to writing as a discipline, and I wanted to feel my voice as a writer. And as soon as I felt like I was getting closer to that, it became a lot easier. And then it became hard again, because then I was working on that as craft, right? And when you're shaping craft, that process is its own challenge, a beautiful one that I've accepted and constantly thinking about. So I'm literally on deadline tonight. So writing about violence, I'm writing about Meg Thee Stallion and Tory Lanez. And so, literally having to constantly think about the language, the writing, the rhythm, the cadence, and what will it feel like for it to me to feel like I'm reading it to you almost when you're engaging it.
Mm-hmm.
We have time for just a couple more. We've had several questions come in about violence in this country, kind of more broadly. Mamadou had asked a question prior to the event, and we've gotten a couple in the chat that have to do with this. Mamadou's question was, the US is allegedly the most violent country in the developed world. Can you please share your thoughts on how we got here? Which is a broad question. And a couple more have come in, sort of more specifically about something like the hot topic of defund the police, but that not very much has changed in recent, months and years. And is there any hope for a system that supports marginalized or struggling people while also stopping crime? I'm curious if you can speak to some of that.
Ooh, yeah. So, Wally, I'll say it's hard for us to get away from what our origins are. And this is why history matters so much. The founding of this nation is an occupation of land, right? We're literally occupying indigenous land. And then we build upon that through a slave trade, right? And build a system of transatlantic slavery that impacts the Americas broadly, but thinking about the United States specifically. We are born out of violence. And I think that's so much of why we see the resistance to projects like the 1619 Project, or those we even talk about even earlier in 1521, depending on when you demarcate, right, the encounter of slavery in the Americas and what constitutes the Americas. And so it's in our nation's founding DNA, right? This kind of violent, cannibalizing, devouring this. And then that literally is brought forth through the productive and reproductive labor of Black women and girls in many ways, right? It is literally through the wealth that's created through enslavement on occupied land that we have that. And so what you see is, of course, in so many areas, it's not coincidental that Indigenous and Black communities are so disparately impacted by almost everything, right? Because they're so at the core of the founding of this nation as one with violence. And so until we're ready to wrestle honestly with our founding and the lack of democracy that undergirds that, I think we'll be constantly evolving the technologies of those same violences, right, against different generations of people. And the second part of that was the broader, I just want to make sure I get it right.
Yeah, it was sort of the is there hope for a system that supports marginalized and struggling people while also stopping crime?
So despite so much of what is the heaviness of tonight, I do end the book-ish with hope. And I talk about the discipline of hope, as I learned from abolitionist teacher, organizer, writer Miriam Kaba. And I talk about that as a discipline and what it means to believe in other systems. And so I'll just give a short story that helped brought it up. On Friday, I was in Durham doing a book talk at a bookstore. And I was actually doing with Melissa Harris Perry, who was one of the conveners of this. And as we're talking, we're 20 minutes into the talk, and I'm talking about, the ways that policing fails, marginalized communities, et cetera. We hear this god awful screech outside, and it is a horrific accident. So much so it looks like the car is coming towards us in the bookstore. And my mother had come down to this talk, and she literally falls out of her chair because it's so alarming and close. So immediately we go outside, we're checking, the person's falling out, he's diabetic, he's bleeding, there's another older couple, and we're creating the care. Right in this moment, we're creating the systems, we're figuring out the family, we're looking for information, we're trying to do this because all of us knew who were at that talk, or many of us who were there, knew the moment that the police and the paramedics arrived, that the whole tenor of care could change. And that's exactly what happened. And so for the rest of pretty much was the time of the event, we spent that being with, right, bearing witness and witness to what was happening, to continue to care for these individuals who just saw their lives flash before their eyes, and hold them and be present with them and be the intermediary between them and the state in that moment, because we could already see how these things were being criminalized. And so I use that story to say that we already have some of the tools, what it means to care for ourselves and to build the kind of communities we want to see. In that moment, we cared for and created a context of care and assistance and support for folks who were needed, not because there was some demand or that's what you have to do. It's because we are called to show up for one another. We are accountable to one another. And for me, that's the hope, because it was everyone who was at that book talk who was like, what can I do? Let me go get the ice. Let me go get the water. Make sure they're doing this. I'm gonna check their pulse. It was like we all stepped in particular ways and then ensured that that encounter didn't become a more deliberate criminalizing encounter, which it was certainly headed towards. And I hate to shudder to think of what it might have turned into had we not been there, or we just kept going with the book event, right? And so I believe in us. That's where my hope lies. I believe in marginalized people. We've changed the world before. We've absolutely changed worlds before. We've changed worlds. My ancestors were enslaved, right? We've changed the world. And so I believe in our capacity to build new worlds. And so that gives me a tremendous amount of hope.
Treva, that is such a beautiful place to end the conversation. Your presence with us tonight is as authentic and as truthful and as inspiring as the manner with which you handled the subject in this wonderful book. And so I recommend it to everybody. It is a life-changing book. It's an important book. It's an archive that rehumanizes the people who are in it, and one that, despite its tragic nature, demonstrates the hope that you just did in that last set of remarks for us. So Treva, thank you as always for being the inspiring person you are. Thank you for being with us tonight. It's been an honor to talk with you about this remarkable book.
Thank y'all so much. It's so good always to be with you, Mr. Garman. I'm thinking back to history summer in between my sophomore and junior year and writing with you, and just thankful. And Monsieur Gay being in your French class, and Ms. Pearson, you working with us with the BSU and so many different projects. It is just heartening. And thank you for that foundation and for the community here. I learned so much at Sidwell. Beautiful, ugly, terrible, wonderful, amazing, the range of things that you're supposed to learn in middle school and high school. But I don't think I would have imagined myself here had it not been for that. So thank you. And thank you to everyone on this call who I love and appreciate for being here and present. It means the world to me.
Thank you. Thank you.
And double O, best class. That's everything.
Love you, Treva.
All right, friends, thank you so much. I feel like we had so much wisdom and grace and thoughtfulness demonstrated tonight that we should end with a moment of shared silence and gratitude. And if we could hold in the light everyone that Treva has spoken about in this book, the people, the Black women and girls who die at the rate of 4 times a day. And I'm remembering Treva also, Nina Simone, when asked what freedom is, she said, it's no fear. And so that we want sometime have a world, a nation, a democracy where there's no fear for any of our citizens. Thank you, friends. Thank you, Treva. Thank you, Anna.
Anna.
Good to
Thank you
see
so
everybody.
much. That was wonderful. Thank you so very much.